like most of you, I had lots of doubts and questions about the official 9/11 story from day one. Only my doubts stemmed from a nearly 30-year airline career. Pretty much everyone in the airline industry questioned what happened on 9/11 from day one. The official government story was pretty hard to believe. We really couldn't talk about it much at work, but eventually we started to discuss it openly amongst ourselves on layovers and that sort of thing. But that took quite some time. As an airline employee's, from an airline employee's point of view, there were so many things wrong with the official government story, it was hard to find a place to start. To begin with, let me just explain. Every year, flight attendants and pilots attend an FAA required training course. As part of that training, they, the government, reinforce the mandatory protocols in the event of a hijacking. It's a step-by-step protocol that every crew member needed to follow. It includes things like code words to let the pilots know we're having a problem in the cabin, there's a hijacker in, obviously he wants in the cockpit, and that we are going to follow every procedure to not let him in. I won't go into all those details, but bottom line is, on 9/11, none of those crew members seem to have followed any of the FAA mandated protocol for hijacking. When I found that out, I couldn't believe it. I could believe it maybe if it happened on one plane, one flight, but not 4 flights on one day. That was just impossible. When I discovered that, I was like, okay, I need to know what the heck's going on. I wanted to know why. For example, on Flight 11, Betty Ong said repeatedly that she was sitting in her jump seat. She must have said it 4 or 5 times. But a flight attendant would never sit in their jump seat during a hijacking. We're actually trained not to. We were told by the FAA as part of that training to remove our name tag, our wings, take a passenger seat if there was one, cover up with a coat or a blanket, and not draw attention to ourselves. In other words, we weren't to look like a crew member, to sort of fade into the woodwork. That would leave the hijacker with just one flight attendant to deal with. And there was reasons for that as well. But I won't go into that. But that person is usually the person up in first class because, of course, the cockpit's up there. And that's the person in charge. The flight attendant, at that time, their only job, the one and only thing, was to prevent the hijackers from entering the cockpit. Now, there was a lot of things that we were going to do that. But we were told on 9/11 at least 2 or more hijackers did actually get into the cockpit. That's what the government story says. But none of the flight attendants ever explained how did they breach the cockpit, if in fact they did. That's unusual. That should have been the first thing they said. That would be the most crucial information for a flight attendant to get out. Not the location of her jump seat or her work position, 3 right. There's just no logical explanation for that. This is a failure by the crew. But I did discover what really happened. And there is an explanation, and there's lots of answers, and I will be covering those in this video series for you, so you'll know what I know. Betty Ong also said pepper spray or mace or something had been sprayed up in business class, and then she said, quote, "We can't breathe up there in business class." Well, she was in the back of the plane. Back of 3 right, which is the very end of the plane. And she didn't have any problems breathing. She never complained about it or was coughing from the spray. That one detail told me that the plane she was on was no longer in the air and it was no longer pressurized. But if they were pressurized, let me just say the irritant would have circulated through the entire cabin, affecting the passengers, the flight attendants, the hijackers, and the cockpit crew. But according to the government story that day, that wasn't the case. It just stayed in business class, and I knew that was impossible. Betty also said she didn't know. She was very confused, and she was talking to a reservation agent, and she said, well, I don't know, but we might be being hijacked. The flight attendants are the first ones to know there's a hijacker on board. There's just no doubt about it. In a hijacking, there's a hijacker. He or she is misbehaving in the aisle. trust me, Betty would have noticed. That's why I found this airplane to show you what it would look like if a person other than a flight attendant is actually in the aisle. Everyone would know, and everyone would know there was trouble brewing, especially the flight attendants. Well, you can see that we don't have one here, so let's carry on. Another big red flag that day was that cell phone calls supposedly were made from altitude on all 4 planes. Well, cell phones just didn't work much above 1,800 feet, which is like the first few seconds after takeoff. This is 2001, mind you. Airphones didn't reach to the flight attendant jump seat at 3 right, as many American Airlines flight attendants have reassured me, which meant Betty was on a cell phone. And in order to make a cell phone call, all of those planes had to have landed. So we had no pressurization, we had mace not moving. You could see where I'm going with this. Then I got a whole bunch of Freedom of Information Act transcripts. They tell a completely contradictory story to the official government story. At the very beginning of my journey, I started finding answers. I somehow, as accidentally, met a Special Forces soldier who was at the Pentagon that day. He reassured me that no 757 had crashed there. He was on the Pentagon lawn. He had no reason to lie to me. And I'm pretty sure at this point, in everything that I'd been uncovering, that it's looking like our own government had a reason to lie. I'll just leave it at that. But if no 757 crashed into the Pentagon, I wanted to know, well, what happened to American Flight 77 then? What did happen at the Pentagon? And why is this official story so impossible to believe, especially by an insider? I eventually gathered a lot of information as I continued to look into 9/11. And I guess I have probably a more believable story if you have the insight from inside the airline. I discovered why pepper spray or mace didn't circulate through the rest of the airplane. I discovered also why none of the flight attendants knew how many hijackers were supposed to be on their plane according to the government. I've learned why Betty Ong never got out of her jump seat, and why cell phones apparently worked at altitude on those 4 special planes. And I also learned why the government lied to us, and they still are. I decided to put it all in a book, and I chose to deliver my discoveries in a novel. I thought that might be best for my own personal safety. By this time, I realized that people who contradicted the government story of 9/11 had a reason to fear, and I was one of them. I had found so much contradictory evidence that I thought if I wrote a novel, it might not be as big a threat to the people that were really behind the 9/11 events. That book manuscript sat on a shelf for almost 2 years. One day I ran into a New York firefighter who had spent about a month on the pile of rubble from the trade centers. I was so inspired after that, I decided to publish the book. And my first book, Methodical Illusion, came out in November of 2014. A few months later, I was invited on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie to discuss the book and all the things I'd uncovered. It was pretty amazing because by morning, that book had soared into the top 10 over all books sold on Amazon. And at that point, from that next day on, I began to hear from people that had information. They'd seen something, they'd heard something. There was something wrong. There was something unusual that day, morning of 9/11 or leading up to it, but they didn't know who to share it with. Most of them feared taking it to any government agency. As a result, I soon became known as the foremost authority on 9/11. I had collected so much information. I was contacted by multiple pilots, flight attendants, air traffic controllers, military personnel, and even several eyewitnesses from the general public. And wait till you find out what they saw. I had no reason to doubt an eyewitness, but there were several, not just from the Pentagon. Their information told me a completely different story from what we were told by the TV and by our media and by our government. As I collected the details, I continued writing the novel series. And when the second book came out, the most unusual thing happened. Methodical deception hit the stores, hit the Amazon, and I was viciously attacked by people who claimed to be 9/11 truthers, online trolls. I'd never met any of these people. I was even labeled an anti-Semite by some real lunatics. Oh, I even had a couple encounters with state-sponsored assassins. My life got totally crazy. But I didn't stop researching or writing. I guess it was my relief to get away from listening to all the craziness going on. I had threats and harassment to family, friends. It was crazy. I had to go dark. I moved several times. I stopped carrying a phone. I learned a great deal about personal safety and security. And I have to tell you, after 15 years or so of researching, what really took place on 9/11 is much, much worse than the truly impossible account they told us. In my next book, if I ever get it done, which will be a nonfiction, you'll learn everything I have found using many government documents, and I will be presenting those things to you here in video, probably before that book gets published. I learned that our intelligence agencies, the FBI, CIA, etc., they don't always tell us the truth. And they're oftentimes very involved in illegal activities that you or I would be prosecuted for. Whether their lie is about Osama bin Laden, Hillary Clinton, or Donald Trump. We have learned this from their own documents that are now declassified, that they are dishonest and that they lied to us. They lied about the John F. Kennedy assassination, the RFK assassination, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the Oklahoma City bombing, the Russia hoax. The truth about 9/11 and the dangers in presenting it is the reason for this Dead Man Switch, for this channel. The truth is now out, it's been uploaded, and it will drop piece by piece over the coming months. If you're interested to subscribe to our channel, hit the bell so you'll be notified. Share it with your friends if you think they want to know the truth or they're able to deal with the truth, but don't believe their propaganda. This series will absolutely blow your mind, as much as it did mine when I made the discoveries that I did, and I will be sharing all of those with you. The videos also will be posted on my membership site, behindthegalleycurtain.com. You're welcome to become a member there. There's a lot of 9/11 inside stuff in there. And if you'd like to order the novel series and get yourself prepped up for what you're about to hear, you can get autographed, personalized books from readroth.com at our store link below in the description box. I want to tell you, just fasten your seatbelts, because this is going to shock many of you. But for others, you knew all along that something was wrong with that official story, and pretty soon you're going to know exactly what it was.